Well, good afternoon, everyone. We appreciate you taking the time out to join us. I am Kim Moore. I reside in Chicago and on the executive committee of CPMC, and will be your host for right now for today. And also, we will have a presenter, Viviana Westbrook, who I will introduce after we do our norm of opening prayer. So let us go into that space. Where you are in your virtual world, just kind of a quiet down as we prepare to pray and then continue on with our seminar for today. Today, I have, again, a prayer for immigrants since we are talking about immigration again on today. So, prayer for immigrants. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Merciful God, we pray for families and individuals who have left or fled their homes, seeking safer and better lives. We lift up to you their hopes, their fears, and their needs, that they may be protected on their journeys, their dignity and rights may be honored and upheld, and they may be welcomed with open arms into generous and compassionate communities. We pray in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. And the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Again, we are excited to have you join us on today. And our presenter today is Viviana Westbrook from the Catholic Legal Immigration Network Clinic. A brief bio for Ms. Westbrook. She is a state and local attorney in the advocacy section. At Clinic, Ms. Westbrook provides strategic and technical support to state and local level immigrant advocates, state Catholic conferences, diocesan agencies, religious communities, and community organizers in their work on immigration or immigrated-related state legislation, local ordinances, and federal state enforcement partnerships. She is admitted to the bar in Maryland, and she grew up in Mexico and is a native Spanish and English speaker. And we welcome her back from her vacation in Mexico. We welcome you to this forum, Ms. Westbrook. So she will take it away. And as always, any questions that come up while she's presenting, please put that in the chat and we will address it at the end of her presentation.
Thank you so much. Let me make sure that I have everything set up here, and let me start sharing my presentation. Great, so as was said, I'm Viviana. I am the state and local advocacy attorney at Clinic. And before Clinic, I do want to flag, I worked for several years, mainly with survivors of gender-based violence. That is like my area of expertise. I did work a little while at Care Coalition with detained children. So I've had some experience, working in detention centers, which is different because children obviously are in our custody, but I've definitely had to deal with a lot of trauma and making sure that the work I do is trauma informed and client centered, which is really important when working with anyone, with any immigrant, but especially when they're in detention. So the importance of accompanying people affected by immigration detention. This is obviously what we're going to be talking about today. This is really, important to have people who are going into these spaces be able to gather information and to be able to give information. And so, we're going to talk about some of the different ways, to share that and what you can share and what you should do with the information that you receive. And also, I'm just going to give a very basic overview about the immigration landscape, just so that everyone can be on the same page when I talk about some of the relief and other forms. So migrants in the US, 45 million people in the US currently are foreign born. And 3/4 of them are here legally. So they can be US citizens, lawful permanent residents, refugees, asylees. Maybe they have a work visa, are here as students, and there's a whole other slew of ways that they can actually be in here. The different visas. So, obviously there are the visas, the family-based petitions where family members can be petitioning for their loved ones, if those family members are, the right relationship and are citizens or lawful permanent residents. And then also, you have things like the work visas, like H-1Bs and H-2As and things for like agricultural workers or people, maybe coming into, let's say, like a tech industry. And right now, I think a big way of getting nurses is through, some of these programs. So, I'm going to set those aside, just know they're out there, but I just want to mention them and now kind of dump them. Humanitarian relief is, a lot of what we see, especially like at the border, in detention. And these are people who are seeking asylum, who, maybe also are going to apply for special immigrant juvenile status if they're young enough. They might have a U visa, T visa, or VAWA. So briefly breaking those down, asylum. Basically, these are refugees who didn't do the process abroad, so they didn't contact, like they didn't go through the UN or do any, didn't wait like in a camp or didn't do any of that to be told they could go to a certain country. Instead, they just picked their country that they wanted to go to and are crossing. But that is completely legal. They are allowed to do that by national law, international law, like that is the norm. Even if we see, different or hear different information on that, like that is what is allowed. And basically people are fleeing persecution. So they could be doing it because the persecution was based on, their political beliefs, their religious beliefs, and there's also, not to get too tied up, but basically, if you hear that someone was persecuted, you want to make sure that they were persecuted on account of something other than just, the gangs are persecuting everyone, because unfortunately in many of these countries, the gangs are persecuting everyone. The U visa is for victims of qualifying crimes in the United States. So anyone who's been a victim of qualifying crime will be eligible for this. And this is really important, especially when it comes to things you might be hearing in detention centers, because it might make some of the things that immigrants experience in these detention centers might make them eligible for a U visa if they report it and are cooperating with the agency at the report, the crime that has happened to them. And I'll get into some of the issues that we see come up and what could be a qualifying crime. The T visa is for people who've been trafficked. I won't get into more detail than that. And of course it could be labor or sex trafficking. I think sometimes we forget about labor trafficking, but that's huge. The VAWA is for that's the Violence Against Women's Act, and basically it's for people who were abused by a partner, significant other. And it doesn't have to be physical violence, obviously domestic violence takes on many forms. But where detention comes into play with this is that we often see that, the abusers, like if the victim calls, the survivor calls the police and the police show up, maybe the survivor had to defend themselves and scratch the abuser, let's say. And all of a sudden the abuser has evidence that they were attacked. And many abusers will be like, oh, look, I was the victim. I was the one that was attacked. A lot of abusers are very smart about where they are harming, the victims. They're making sure that it's, unidentifiable, that it's in places that don't show up so easily, that are more discreet. And so oftentimes then, we see the survivors getting put in detention. They might get put in jail and they could end up in detention depending on what that jail's like rules are. There's 287G agreements. Again, get into it, but basically it's an agreement between local law enforcement and ICE where they're sharing information. And so ICE all of a sudden will get information like, oh yeah, we arrested this woman. Looks like she's undocumented, like come pick her up. And I've had clients who got put into the system and got put into removal proceedings because of this, which is really unfortunate. So it's important to keep in mind that you might be encountering people in these situations. Finally, the special immigrant juvenile status, this is for people who, well, for kids under 21. They have to apply before they turn 21. And they have to go through a family court hearing and have custody. And basically they need to have one parent who has abused, abandoned, or neglected them. So, in order to go to family court, obviously they're going to need to be released, but, some of the people you work with might be released. And, there's that really weird age. Kids go from the Office of Refugee Resettlement custody at the age of 18. That is when they are transferred into regular adult detention. So there's the 18, 19, and 20 year where they still are qualifying for SIDGE, but, are not still, with ORR. So, if someone's very young, you might just want to keep an ear out for that. Okay. So I wanted to have a languages spoken at home other than English, and just to kind of give an idea as to what kinds of languages you might encounter. Language access is so important. A lot of times this is going to be a huge issue because they might not be receiving it. They might be asked to sign documents that they have not had translated into or interpreted into a language that they understand. And all of a sudden it turns out that they just signed like a self-deportation order, having been told it was something completely different. So it's really important to have language access. And we really get into some issues with like indigenous languages because it's challenging to find interpreters. And, people ICE likes to assume they're like, they can speak Spanish-ish. They look like they're, from Latin America. And it's like, well, yeah, they are from Latin America, but they're from an indigenous community. You have to talk to them in their indigenous language. This is very complicated information, and like you have to have it like in your first native language as it is. It's hard enough to understand it in your native language. Okay, and I just kind of wanted to give a general idea as to how employment is working for immigrant workers versus US born workers. And, you just see that we have a lot of immigrant workers in the natural resources, construction, maintenance, production, transportation, material moving, service occupations. And this is really important. And I think as we go on, I think you'll see that there's like a lot of opportunity for leveraging the fact that immigrants are so key to our labor. Obviously, when they're in detention, we are not able to access that wonderful resource of labor that they bring. But I think that is a point to try to advocate for releasing. Okay, so migrants in detention. So here's some of the numbers. As of the 3rd of October, ICE held 36,845 immigrants. And let me just be clear, I'm going to share this with everyone after the presentation, so you don't have to write down all of this. And these have links to where I got the information from. And I know this is from the TRAC site. TRAC has so much good information, a lot of statistics. If you're looking for numbers, that is the place to go. And you'll see that 69.6% of ICE immigrant detainees have no criminal record. So that is like that is the majority of detainees. And the ones that are remaining that do have a record, like most of them are really for like minor offenses. They're not violent. They can be traffic violations that just got them, detained. And that is something that is problematic, especially with the conditions of detention. Okay, so here are some of the issues that migrants may face prior to detention. Some of them include like why they're coming. So, violence, threats of violence. Like obviously I had many clients who were in abusive relationships. And this included children who had abusive parents or step parents, it's not just spousal, it could be parent-child, child-parent, war, obviously, war is a big one, extreme poverty. Some people are like, they are dying, they have no real food to eat. So they just take their chances in making their way up here because they have no other solution. Also natural disasters that go hand in hand with climate change issues. We see a lot of refugees coming from these. Sometimes temporary protected status might be given because of some of these factors. But it is an arduous journey to the US. I was just in Oaxaca, and when I was in Oaxaca, I saw encampments of Venezuelan immigrants. There were just like tents that they had set up outside. It was cold in the evenings, and they were just sleeping there. And some of the families didn't have tents because they'd been stolen. There was a family where there was like a little 6-8-year-old with her parents, her pregnant mother, who was sleeping on the cold ground every day. And they had traveled like 4 months by foot to get to Oaxaca. And so, it's really a tough journey. You hear the numbers and you're like, okay, it took a while. Yeah, sure. But knowing the day to day and seeing the toll that it takes, just know that you are having people arrive to detention centers with a lot of trauma. Okay, so here are some of the potential issues that occur while in detention. So detention fatigue, like this can happen, some people will have more resilience than others, but you are in detention, and you are made to feel less than human, unfortunately, because a lot of the conditions are not great. A lot of the people working in these areas are not amazing. There is a big mistrust of authority figures that are coming from their home countries, where authority figures are incredibly corrupt, can be bought off, have never helped them. So anything that's coming from people in the system is going to be viewed with a lot of mistrust, which again, I think is an excellent opportunity for those going in to do ministry, because you all are coming from such a different place and it will be received in a very different way. And you have an opportunity to build that trust. There's also a lack of adequate healthcare. I cannot tell you enough, like how often I've heard from my clients, like, oh yeah, they didn't let me have like my asthma inhaler. Oh yeah, I had these pills that were like my heart medication pills, and I asked to have them, but they wouldn't give them to me. So I ended up in the ER, or ended up in the, and unfortunately, like just this week, I read some article about, because of mistreatment and lack of healthcare, and just ignoring someone speaking their health needs, that they died and are, this detention center is now being investigated. But I have to say, I've never heard anything positive about any detention center, unfortunately. So just flagging. Human rights violations, we have heard things like that I know at one point Cameroonians were being forced to sign their own deportation orders, and those who weren't signing were being maced or pepper sprayed or same thing. And there's also like sexual assault that has happened. I know that the things that happened in Irwin, in Georgia, that detention center, where there were a lot of procedures that were done to women without their informed consent, and was highly problematic. So we have a lot of issues that are ongoing, lack of adequate sanitation and nutrition. Also hear horror stories about this, no interpretation or translation, like I mentioned, and a lot of misinformation. Immigrants are getting the information from like ICE, and ICE is very biased, and they have every reason to give incorrect information. So it's so important to have someone who's coming in and being like, hey, this is the real information. Here are your trusted sources, and letting immigrants know who they can trust. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of skip over this. This has a little bit more about some of the challenges you see. I put some of the, instances of when we have seen, violations, and you can read more about all these things in detail. Here's something about Cameroonians where officers were forcibly taking their fingerprints. So they were grabbing them and holding them down while they, put the fingerprints down on the paper. Retaliation is a huge issue. So, a lot of immigrants in detention will protest conditions. You'll hear things about like hunger strikes, or that, someone's a whistleblower. And then when that happens, a lot of times, ICE will then deport the people who tried to stand up for themselves. So, once they're out of the country, right? Like, even though ICE might get a slap on the wrist for doing that, it's very hard to help them at that point and to get them back. So, sexual misconduct. Okay. So for those of you wondering, what are the rights immigrants have in detention? So you have the right to call, receive visits from a lawyer, your consulate, and your family once you're detained. And this has a very in-depth, information about how you can get this. This is from the National Immigrant Law Center, NILC. And basically, NILC has great information. NILC is an amazing organization. Anything you have from NILC can be 100% trusted. Basically, if you don't see, like, the numbers of the consulate should be posted in these detention centers, but if they're not, you should ask. The immigrant has the right to ask the deportation officer, one of the officers, for a list. The government's not going to provide immigrants with an attorney. It's not like criminal law, where one's going to be appointed to them. So immigrants have to call law offices to hire an attorney, or nonprofits to try to get one. But very few nonprofits will take on a client when they are in removal proceedings. So it's important to find one that will. And there's a directory from the American Immigration Lawyers Association, that's AILA. And I also put the National Immigration Project, Find a Lawyer tool. And the DOJ has a list of pro bono legal service providers by state. And then Immigration Law Helps, there's a directory of nonprofit low cost legal help. So these are all really great resources to have. Okay, so families can also find their loved ones. So they do need to have the immigrant's full name and their A number at the ready. And so any documents that an immigrant has gotten who has been detained, like, they will have an A number. Like, just look for it, somewhere at it's like an 8 or 9 digit code that starts with an A. And so they should have that. And then they can either go online to the detainee locator system, or they can call the local ICE office or detention and reporting information line. And so these are two ways that, families can help find. And it's important, since they want to visit, this is good information to have. Also, immigrants can seek bond. We have the right to ask for bond so that the immigrant can be released. The immigrant can ask ICE to set a bond. ICE might decide not to do it, or they might set it and it's really high. And at that point, then they can ask for a hearing with an immigration judge to go forward. Now, one thing to flag is that I know for Black immigrants, bond is much more frequently denied, and set also for when it is given at a much higher amount. So this is something that's important to know, especially if you want to do any advocacy. This is definitely a pain point in the system. Bond funds. So for people who need help finding bond funds, there's a directory of community bail funds, but I do flag that you have the National Immigration Detention Bond Fund, RAICES Bond Fund, Envision Freedom Fund, LGBTQ Freedom Fund, and the Black Immigrants Bail Fund. Now, the last one, Black Immigrants Bail Fund, I can attest, it does some great work, and I contribute to them financially. So, sometimes that's just like an easy way when people are like, how can I help? Money helps. So there is one place. Okay, so this is really important. Avoiding the unlicensed practice of immigration law, or UPIL, as I will refer to it as. So you want to know what the difference is between legal advice and legal information. You cannot give legal advice, but you can give legal information. So legal information is going to be anything that, is in the public domain that you can just, cite to be like, oh, I got this from Milk's page. They have great information on blah, blah, blah. They say, and that way, it's you're kind of citing your source and you're letting them know it's not coming from you, it's coming from somewhere else. Like, be like, this is the org that has said this. And you won't run into as many issues. I also think like doing a little know your rights presentation the first time you meet someone is a good idea, and to do it up front before you talk to them about anything, because once they start talking, you might end up kind of crossing the line. So you want to be careful. But just having a nice little quick know your rights presentation where you're like, hey, here are your rights as, an immigrant in detention. You have the right to, phone your attorney. You have the right to meet with your attorney and your family or your consulate if you want. You have the right, right to request bond. You have, just kind of be like per nilk. And then just, it's all very general. But the difference, you can talk about, and there's some forms of relief like U visa, T visa, asylum, blah, blah. And you can do a very quick overview, be like, this is like, you could be like, oh, clinic gave me like a little primer on it. Like, this is what that says, boom, but then like, if they start to say, well, in my case, like, you just want to kind of cut them, like, you just want to be like, just so you know, I cannot give you legal advice. You can share with me what happened. I'm happy to hear about it, love to know more about you. But just know I cannot make any kind of observation about what kind of relief you should apply for or what it sounds like you may qualify. Like, I cannot say that, because once you start telling them things like that, then, you are getting in the realm of UPIL. So make sure that you don't draft any legal documents. Now there is if at some point it gets to that, some people, you can prepare forms, but it's very like, it would have to be like they had consulted with an attorney, they now knew what their relief was, and they wanted to maybe fill out some paperwork. And let's say you can speak multiple languages, and so all you're doing is translating and just putting, like, reading the question and putting like whatever they say down, like kind of verbatim. Like, you're not giving any input whatsoever. If you're like, oh, should I put this or that? No, you tell me, it's your document. Like, that's the only thing. You cannot give any advice. Okay, so reporting violations. This is like a little chart of all the offices in the Department of Homeland Security that have oversight. So you have the Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman, or OIDO. I call it the Ombudsman's. Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, CRCL, and Office of the Inspector General. Lots of little other ones to note and, are important to check if you want to, but these are the top three. These are the ones that you really can be referring these issues to, and each of them have like an email to reach out to. The Ombudsman's office is fairly new. It's only been around since 2020, but they are really raring to go and really want to hear from people. The OIG, Office of Inspector Generals, they kind of have first dibs at these types of cases, and I put like things in there like custodial death, denial of rights, profiling, use of force, retaliation. But then if they decide not to pursue, you can still go to like CRCL or the Ombudsman. So these are really important to know. CRCL does civil liberties and complaints. They are the ones that have like the first dibs at disability discrimination, and also failure to accommodate not just disability, but also religion, which again, if you all have any issues trying to get in or trying to do any of this work, this is where you should be going. Okay. So here are resources on immigration detention. I listed a bunch of them that are great. I really like SALT, the South Asian Americans Resources for Detained Immigrants and their allies, because they really break it down and have a very inclusive list. So, please check these resources out. Detention related laws. Some states have laws regarding disallowing privately owned detention centers in the state. So that means that they're just trying to get rid of it. Others, like Virginia, have laws that allow greater oversight in private prisons. So they might be having like their, one of their agencies go in and do inspections to make sure that like the conditions there are up to par. That people are getting their medications, that they have decent food and sanitation. Now, the problem with the laws where they're just blanket getting rid of these privately owned detention centers is that then they move to states that are not as welcoming to immigrants, and they go to those states, which then means that the immigrants lose a lot of the resources they have. They might lose their representation, because it's not like, a New York attorney is all of a sudden going to go to Georgia. I mean, they might if they're paid for it, but like if it's a nonprofit, like they can't do that. And it's very hard. They might also lose access to their family, community. And since like in that example, they've moved to Georgia, Georgia has a much lower rate of granting things like asylum than New York judges do. So, clinic does not get involved in these. We kind of just step from a back, because, detention centers are awful and they have horrible conditions, but we also don't believe in a blanket, like get rid of all of them for forever. I mean, especially having worked with survivors, I have seen a lot of abusers out there, and the idea of just releasing all of them into their communities fills me with dread. So I feel like there are many ways to improve things, and it definitely needs reforming, and we definitely need to cut back on detention. And obviously family detention is not is a no-go, like that we will get involved with and ensure, because obviously like it's deplorable to detain families, but some advocates will make it seem like a black and white issue, and I just want to make sure that you all know it's very nuanced and it isn't. Okay, other laws to assist immigrants. So these help immigrants at the state and local level, like getting identifications, because having some sort of ID, even if it's just like a local ID and it's only good for like that municipality, it doesn't matter, it really helps, because then people can go maybe get a bank account, they can go to the library, there's like lots of little ways where these identifications can really make a big difference. Driver's licenses, being able to get around, take yourself, your family to outings, to your job, to school, to get healthcare. These are all so important, and really, there's a lot of activity around this, really important. Office of New Americans, it's really great to have one central location where, a lot of the activity and advocacy for immigrants is occurring, so you don't have to do so much heavy lifting on your own. U visa, T visa certifications, these are my babies. I am very passionate about this issue, and I work very closely with a lot of local law enforcement, trying to improve relationships and trying to really lift up having good laws so that they are certifying for immigrants that cooperate with them, because you need to have a certification in order to apply for a U visa. T visa is not required, but it is strongly recommended. Voting rights, you might be like, oh, can immigrants vote? Not at the federal level, but state and localities have been, gifted with the ability to make these decisions for themselves. So if your state constitution doesn't disallow it, then you can allow immigrants to vote. Like right now, we are working hard in Maryland, in a conservative, like probably the most conservative county we have, to allow voting rights. And we went from a really cold, like, oh no, we don't want to give voting rights even to people with lawful status, to yeah, we are enthusiastic to give voting rights to everyone, regardless of status, because it's just a matter of educating. When you go up and you bring people from the community, you get immigrants up there telling their stories, you have people like me who can also back it up and be like, hey, people who apply for U visas are going to be waiting for like 15 years. That is not their fault. Are you going to make them wait 15 years before they have status to let them vote? Like, that just seems really mean. Unemployment compensation, undocumented immigrants do not qualify for unemployment. And yet, the vast majority of them are paying taxes with ITIN numbers. So, when COVID hit, that meant that they had no safety net whatsoever. They weren't getting any of the federal checks, and they weren't getting any help at the state level. So it's really important to have some sort of system at the state level that can provide the safety net for immigrants, who are working. They should get unemployment. Healthcare is huge, like opening up access in your state. Like, you can give them access to the benefit plan. Like, Maryland tried to pass something this year. We were not successful. It got held up in the Senate. We passed the House, but we're hoping next year we can get it moving. Tuition equity, making sure that immigrants can qualify for in-state tuition, because sometimes laws say silly things about needing to be like a citizen or, to qualify for that, and of course, if they've lived there and meet the other qualifications for in-state tuition, they should be receiving it. Because I've had too many young clients who have had to work full-time and take like one credit at a time at a community college, paying for it, painstakingly. And that's just not fair. It does not even a very an already uneven playing field. And again, good relationships with local law enforcement. Okay, sorry. So ways to get involved. What comes next? There are so many ways. You can talk to your local politicians if there's an issue that you feel, strongly about. If you're like, I think I know, I've heard the stories from people in detention, but I don't know what the bigger issue is or what I'm trying to push for, talk to local immigration organizations, chat with immigrants where you find them. So, church, marketplace, work, school, any place that you're already kind of interacting with them naturally. Like, feel free to strike up a conversation and maybe ask, like, hey, I heard about this issue. Like, is this something impacting you? Make it sound more smoothly, and like, don't just be like, hey. But write an op-ed. Every politician I speak to talks about the power of op-eds. So write an op-ed. And I have written several op-eds. I give a training on how to write an op-ed. And it's something that is just very impactful. You can also write an article if you want to have it be a little bit broader and get more in depth. You can go to a march, a rally, donate to a bail fund, give testimony when you have these bills that come up, because oftentimes, a faith-based voice is missing. And so that's where I try really hard to make sure that Clinic is able to weigh in areas where, there isn't anyone speaking up for immigrants in that context, in that way. And this is really important because for a lot of other more conservative leaning folks, politicians, when it comes to immigrant matters, like when they hear faith-based voices, it makes a real impact. So I can't stress that enough. Okay, so then I have all our resources there. These are things that I put together and that I think are really useful. I put together a yearly overview of the state and local laws that we saw, some that pass and that don't, and just kind of breaking down the analysis of why they're important and blah, blah, blah. I really want to stress that if you go to this link, you can subscribe to all of Clinic's lists that we have, but that includes the monthly state and local advocacy newsletter, which I write, and I try to write with updated information. So yeah, if you have any questions, please email me or contact me at 410-693-0859. Sorry, I feel like I went over, but does the clinic have brochures with immigrants' rights? like what their rights are, like a little pamphlet that people could easily know, but I think we could easily create one, or maybe I'll check to see if Milk or some of the others have, so I'm not recreating the wheel, but yeah. Here, let me stop sharing. So are there any other questions?
So far, there was only one in the chat, but we again ask you to, if you have a question, to put it in the chat, or, I mean, there's a small enough group. If you just raise your hand, we can do that too. Karen, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, Vivian, this is wonderful, and I love we'd love to even partner with you to make a brochure or something that people can have just to run off. I mean, because you can make your notes, but when you go in, it's, as you know what the centers are like, it's kind of crazy to have to remember, or all the things that you need to tell them. But also, do y'all have any kind of little video? Have you made any little videos or little vignettes on some of these pieces, like how to write an op-ed? Just
we have not. Videos are not our forte. We're not our forte, but we just hired a video expert because we are trying to get into that and expand and make sure that we do have videos, especially because we have people who are fluent in more than one language, and we really want to put out these materials in different languages. And we're just about to expand into that. So this would be I feel like a great like guinea pig video to start with, since I know they're looking for like a guinea pig video.
No, I mean, it's a great overview, but I could just see taking some of these little pieces, like how to write an op-ed, and just give them a 5-minute or less, and so people could just go on there as a resource and click on that one. And yeah, there's just and I mean, I was fascinated by the voting option. All these years, especially even in Texas, had no clue. I mean, Texas may not be one that's obviously friendly for that, but that's something to work towards and count.
No, absolutely. And I think that it's really exciting when you talk to someone who was just parroting back some very negative narratives that unfortunately we hear perpetuated, and then all of a sudden they just become an ally for you because you reached them. You touched something in them with just sharing a story, or sharing facts. It depends on who you're talking to. Some people like one more than the other. I tend to think that stories overall are more impactful, which is why getting stories from detained individuals is so important, because when you have those, like, it just really changes the game. And of course, just like a little side, like, I know you probably know, but as an attorney, you always have to do not share any, personal identifying information of the immigrant unless you have their written and express consent and they understand exactly what that means. But you can share like general narratives, like be like, this is what happened, an immigrant, who was detained shared that XYZ in very broad, and as long as it isn't something that clearly, singles out that one immigrant, like you can share that.
Okay, there are a couple of questions. Let's see, Prisoners Watch EWTN. Have you reached out to EWTN to provide rights presentation, etc.?
No, I have not. My job, because I work with all 50 states and DC, it tends to be more reactive than proactive. So I tend to do more of, when people reach out to me, then I'm like, yes, that sounds amazing, than going out. But if you all have a contact or know someone who would be probably interested in something like that, please share that with me. I don't know if this was recorded. Sorry, I'm going
yes,
to the next.
Yes, it is. It was recorded,
great.
And a link will be available in a few days or so.
Okay, fantastic. And I'll share my PowerPoint, so you also have all of that as well.
Okay, great. I have a question, even though it's not really related to ICE immigrants or ICE detained immigrants. And in Chicago, we have over 20,000 immigrants that have been sent here from Texas since 2022. And we get a lot here at St. Sabina because of the fact that we're located near a police station. So a lot of them are at all the police stations around the city. And so we have one that's close to us. And so we've been kind of trying to provide, um, you know, most of us do not speak Spanish at all. So, using a little translator app on the phones to kind of communicate with them, mostly from Venezuela. We've had some from Haiti also. Um, and so we've been trying to provide, sometimes sleeping bags, coats lately, because, it's cold here and they're coming from a warm climate, food carts like McDonald's or whatever, and, bus carts so they can get around the city. But they have not been approved, I don't think, to work. And I know the mayor just issued, I don't know whether it's going to become law, whatever they want to call it, that they can stay 60 days in a shelter. So, I mean, what agencies should we maybe be referring them to for assistance?
Well, excuse me. You could always start with the mayor's office. They did, at least before, they had like a liaison for new immigrant arrivals. I don't know if with the new mayor things have
It's
changed.
useless. It's useless.
Okay.
He's almost part of the problem, not part of the solution. But any other maybe, I guess Illinois agencies or local agencies that might work besides maybe the mayor's office.
Well, I don't know if like so I know the Office of the New Americans exists, but I think it exists as part of the mayor's office, but sometimes, they might be part of it, but they still are very independent and will have a lot of interactions with all the agencies that are impacting immigrant arrivals. So, I would really reach out to them, especially because I think Chicago has a pretty robust office. And talk to them, from there. Unfortunately, there is a huge housing shortage, across the country, and everyone who's getting immigrants are facing these issues. And it's definitely something, something that I would love to see. And I think Chicago was trying to do some of this, is, getting government agencies working with faith-based groups and also nonprofits like homeless shelter nonprofits, also, those giving like immigration legal services, and just kind of coming together to provide a holistic support system, and to also, tap into our system, our network of faith individuals, and just be like, hey, people need shelter. Like, who's willing to provide like someone a place to sleep tonight, or a place to shower because they just got in, or a sandwich, or whatever it is, interpretation. Like, I've definitely gone to volunteer in DC for the arrivals, but I feel like right now it's kind of drinking from a hose. It's just a constant barrage that's happening, and we really need more housing. And I think anything you can do to push the government to give more housing, and to push people to be okay with having housing in their areas, because I think a lot of suburbs have been very possessive of their land and of their space, and they're like, no, I don't want you to do XYZ or open this up, or I don't want my this gymnasium, or this property that's not being used right now, like, you can't have this. So I think doing more education, making it a reality of what it means for people to be sleeping on the streets in the middle of winter in Chicago, I think is something that needs to really get into people's minds. Like, I think, yeah, it's a big issue.
Right. And I know that there's been talk with the Archdiocese to try to open up some of these empty rectories and convents that we have an abundance of here in Chicago. So,
Oh, wow. Well,
So
that would
there's
be
been
amazing.
talk about that. I mean, and the Cardinal is kind of open to people churches reaching out to immigrant families to maybe house them. But from what I heard, it's like, well, maybe just only have one though, not more than one as it could cause some division or something. Anyway, so it's still a challenge, but people are,
Well,
bureaucracy in the church.
it's definitely a challenge. And like right now, there are so many people, like hundreds of immigrants just sleeping in police stations. And
Right.
unfortunately, like I know I read an article like a few weeks or maybe months ago where they talked about that there were sexual abuse allegations, that a young girl was sexually assaulted by one of the police officers. So these things, like immigrants need to be in a safe environment. Like they need to be going somewhere that they can just decompress from everything, from all the trauma that they have been through, and start the healing process, start going forward. You can also do federal advocacy. Of course, a lot of the things I talk about is state and local advocacy. I feel like this is where you have a lot of personal contact and where stories really matter and where you can change a lot of hearts and minds. But there is federal advocacy. So if you want to get start talking to your Congress, folks over at the federal level and tell them, hey, you need to get people employment authorizations quick. People who are applying for asylum, why do we make them wait 180 days? What are they supposed to do in those 6 months? Starve? So, just like start making the calls, I feel like if there was like a flooding of these requests, like we would start seeing some movement. But, USCIS is so backlogged that that is always a tricky situation.
An example on how faith-based advocacy is impactful. James Rose was asking that.
Faith-based advocacy. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's impactful because, I think sometimes, for instance, there was a bill this last year, I think I mentioned it in Maryland, that was healthcare, access to healthcare for everyone. So it would have opened up our, Maryland health, Obamacare in Maryland to immigrants. Basically, you ask the federal government for a waiver, and then once you get it, then you can enroll them in there so they can also sign up for healthcare through the network. But we were saying it's really important to have, healthcare. And we had tons of people from like nurses, doctors, people giving like statistics and numbers and what have you. And yet the most impactful testimony, and I had written testimony, getting to Annapolis and dealing with the things of giving oral testimony can be really challenging. But written testimony is important. But the most impactful one was from this, I think he was a Lutheran minister, and he just talked about, our calling and, welcoming the stranger and why it's so important. And he's like, why are we talking about numbers? You can't put numbers on people's lives. He's like, this is something that if we hold ourselves to our values, if we're saying that we want to welcome and to truly embrace them as part of the community. And I can't channel his words because it was just, I got goosebumps when he spoke. But if you really want to hear it, I can go dig through my notes and find it. Like I know that Maryland keeps their testimonies accessible, so you can hear it. And I just sat there and I was like, so I feel like having someone who can really make people think, and also people who claim, because a lot of conservatives claim to be faith-based, individuals, and being like, we're holding you to that. You say you're that, then we want to see those values, please have those. Okay, so Karen, sorry, you've been waiting for a while.
Karen, yeah, and Karen is the last question before we wrap up.
No, Viviana, this gathering, this town hall is to energize our ministers and those that are going in to take these stories to their legislators. And so on that note, you hit on one of the employment authorization. Is there another area that we as a whole should be focused and thinking about as far as upcoming legislation, or even beginning the conversation in preventative legislation?
I mean,
Is there an area
at
you're focusing on?
I mean, if you're looking at the federal level, right, like EADs always a big one. Also, because U visas are near and dear to my heart right now. Because of Congress, only 10,000 U visas are granted every year. There is currently a backlog of a backlog of 180,000 U visas. So y'all can do the math on that. It's really frustrating because that means people are just in this limbo state for years and years and years and years. And like, it really is unacceptable. But I'd also say, like, if you're looking for like areas to really start advocacy in your states, especially if you are in a more conservative area, I would say, focus on professional licensing laws, which these laws will allow, but there are some laws that will say, oh, you can only, become a lawyer or a doctor or a nurse or a teacher if you are a US citizen. Don't have these things in your laws. Like, get rid of them if you have them. It should just be open to everyone. And people try to like finagle it, like, oh, well, then maybe we should do it for those who have work authorization. No. Some people's work authorization will be dependent on being licensed. So they need to get licensed first before they can get hired. Mm-hmm. And so, like, just opening up to everyone is just the better path to follow for that. And then there's also, professional licensing laws in terms of having things that recognize like foreign-based training and education. Because like I had an intern a couple of years ago that he was an attorney back in Venezuela. Like, he was an attorney and he was going back through like the process of going to law school, just because, you have to go to law school, you take the bar, you take the and it was like a whole thing. And, like, they're just certain states do have laws that will acknowledge this, but we need to make it like across all the states, because honestly, we need the work. And there's a lot of brain waste over there. We have people that have these amazing qualifications coming here and they're not using that, and we can do better, and having things like language access, resources, trainings, so that even people who might speak some English can get to the level of English they need to be able to practice their profession here. Those are so important, because we see some intro English level courses, but then we don't have the more advanced ones that are being given, and those are really needed. And I will also say U visa certification laws. I love these because I feel like it's a way to start conversations around immigrants as victims instead of criminals, which is often misinformation that we hear a lot of. And it's a way to open up conversations with, law enforcement. Now, don't get me wrong, some law enforcement are not going to want to hear it. You're just, despite all your best efforts, it's not the, but many actually are receptive. Like, if you talk and you're like, hey, this is what happened, or I just talked to someone who, because she was, the victim of domestic violence, ended up in detention. How is this okay? Like, can you sign this? Like, she wants to cooperate. Like, how can we work together? Like, can you have a better policy? And I think that, between these two, I've seen a lot of really good movement in states that used to be, conservative on immigration matters and are now being very like positive and just putting out great laws. So I think these are kind of, I don't want to call them the gateway laws, but kind of, I think they open up people's hearts and minds.
Well, Viviana, we want to thank you for your time and your presentation on this useful information. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Again, Viviana, thank you for providing the information that you have provided to us on today. And I just wish everyone a very blessed Thanksgiving as we are going into that season. And if we don't see you, Christmas, very blessed holiday season. So be blessed, and we'll see you hopefully soon in December. Take care.